My brother waited until the candles were lit to bring out the clipboard. 70 candles on a sheet cake, my father's face lit orange in the glow, and Derek standing behind him with a pen already uncapped, saying, "Dad, remember, you just need to initial here and here, it's just the paperwork we talked about." My father, who by then couldn't reliably remember what he'd eaten for breakfast, picked up the pen the way he'd pick up any pen handed to him by his son. I let him get exactly one initial down before I set my own folder on the table next to the cake. "Actually," I said, "Dad already has someone managing his affairs. Me. Since March." Derek's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we sit with the quiet people who finally stopped watching the damage happen and started keeping score. If you've ever watched someone you love get maneuvered by someone else's charm, you'll feel this one. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. My name is Vivian Okafor. I'm 35, and I work as a senior appeals specialist for a regional hospital system, which is a fancier way of saying I spend my days reading insurance denials line by line and finding the one clause the insurer hoped nobody would notice, so that sick people don't end up owing more than they actually should. It's detail work. It's patient work. It has taught me, more than anything else in my life, that the people who lose the most are almost never the ones who did anything wrong. They're the ones who didn't read closely enough, or didn't have anyone reading closely on their behalf. I want you to understand something about how that job has shaped me, because it matters to everything that follows. An appeal only succeeds if you can point to something specific and verifiable, a date, a policy clause, a documented conversation, not a feeling, however justified the feeling might be. Insurance companies do not reverse a denial because a family is sympathetic. They reverse it because the paper trail leaves them no other honest option. I have spent 9 years building that instinct into everything I do, and it turned out, in ways I never expected, to be exactly the instinct my own family would eventually need me to bring home. My father is the reason I do this job at all, though he doesn't know that, and by the time this story reaches its real turning point, he wasn't always able to know much of anything with certainty. His name is Walter Okafor. He's 70 now. He spent 41 years as a machinist, the kind of work that leaves a particular quiet dignity in a man's hands, and he raised my brother Derek and me largely on his own after our mother died of an aneurysm when I was 19 and Derek was 16. He never remarried. He built a small, steady life around us instead, the kind of life where nothing was ever flashy, but nothing was ever missing either. 3 years ago, in a routine appointment nobody expected to matter, his doctor used the phrase, mild cognitive impairment, for the first time. 18 months after that, the word changed to early-stage dementia, and the world I'd grown up in, steady, predictable, my father always the calmest person in any room, began, slowly and then not slowly at all, to change shape underneath me. To understand what happened at that birthday dinner, you need to understand the difference between my brother and me, because it's the same difference that ran under everything in our family long before our father got sick, and it's the difference that made Derek's plan work as well as it did, for as long as it did. Derek is charming in a way that opens doors before he's even finished knocking. He's 2 years younger than me, works in sales for a regional auto dealership group, and has always been the kind of person a room warms up for the moment he walks into it. Growing up, Derek got away with things I never could have, not because our father loved him more. I want to be fair here, I don't actually believe that, but because Derek had a gift for making his mistakes look like charm, and I had a habit of making my competence look like nothing worth noticing. By the time our father's diagnosis arrived, Derek's adult life looked, from the outside, like a success story. A nice apartment, a newer car, a girlfriend named Priya who seemed genuinely kind whenever I met her at family gatherings. What I didn't know, and wouldn't fully understand until much later, was that most of that visible success was financed on credit that had quietly outpaced his actual income for years, the specific kind of debt that people in sales sometimes carry because commission months make it easy to believe the lean months are the exception rather than the pattern. I don't say this to excuse what he eventually did. I say it because understanding it helped me, later, separate the brother who loved our father from the specific financial panic that pushed him toward a decision he wouldn't have made in any other circumstance. When our mother died, Derek was 16 and fell apart in loud, visible ways. Skipped school, got in a car accident that totaled a vehicle we couldn't afford to lose, needed constant attention and constant forgiveness. I was 19, in my second year of community college, and I fell apart quietly, in a way that looked, from the outside, like not falling apart at all. I picked up more hours at my part-time job. I started managing the household bills because my father, in the fog of early grief, kept forgetting to pay them, and someone needed to. I never once framed it as a sacrifice. It was simply the shape my grief took, organizing, tracking, making sure nothing else broke while everything already had. That pattern never really stopped. By the time our father's diagnosis arrived, I had been quietly the one who understood our family's finances for 16 years, the one who knew which accounts existed and which bills came due when, while Derek remained, charmingly, mostly unaware that any of it required managing at all. There's a specific memory I keep returning to from the year after our mother died, the way you return to a single clause that turns out to have controlled an entire contract. I was 20, home from community college for the summer, and I discovered, going through the mail our father had let pile up for weeks, that the mortgage was 2 payments behind, not because we couldn't afford it, but because nobody had been opening the envelopes. I set up autopay that week, quietly, without telling either of them, and I never once mentioned it again. Derek, that same summer, wrecked the family's second car doing something reckless with friends, and our father spent an entire Saturday on the phone with the insurance company, patient and forgiving, the way parents are patient and forgiving with the child who is visibly struggling. Nobody spent a Saturday noticing that the mortgage had quietly stopped almost lapsing, because a lapse you prevent doesn't look like anything at all. I didn't resent that at 20. I understood it, even then, as the shape grief happened to take in our house. Loud problems got attention, and quiet competence got assumed. It took me another decade to recognize that assumption as its own kind of cost. When Dad's memory started slipping in earnest, I was the one who started driving him to appointments, because Derek's job, he explained, made it hard to get away during the day. I was the one who learned the names of his medications, who found the elder care attorney, who read, twice, every pamphlet the hospital social worker handed us about long-term planning. Derek visited on weekends, brought takeout, made Dad laugh, and left before the harder conversations started. I don't say this bitterly, entirely. I say it because it's exactly the arrangement that made what came next possible. If you've ever been the sibling who quietly managed the hard parts while someone else managed the good moods, comment the hard parts below. Before I tell you what Derek was actually planning, I want you to know who my father was before any of this started, because it matters to everything that comes after. I don't want you to only know my father as a diagnosis, a folder, a man confused at his own birthday party, so before I go further into what Derek did, I want to tell you who Walter Okafor actually was, for the 40 years before any of this started, because I think it explains why protecting him mattered to me the way it did. My father spent 4 decades on a factory floor, running lathes and mills with a precision he was quietly, deeply proud of, the kind of pride that never once turned into arrogance because he genuinely believed the work itself was the reward. He used to bring me to the shop on Saturdays when I was small, before my mother died, and let me watch him true up a piece of metal to a tolerance so fine you needed a caliper to appreciate it, and he'd explain, patiently, why the extra 10 minutes of careful measuring mattered more than the 20 minutes you'd save by rushing. I think, looking back, that's where I actually learned to read fine print for a living, not in a classroom, but standing beside a man who believed that getting the small details right was its own form of respect for the people who'd eventually depend on your work. After my mother died, he never once made either of us feel like a burden, even in the years when I know, now, as an adult, that money was tighter than either of us understood at the time. He worked overtime he didn't have to work so that Derek could play travel soccer, and he never once mentioned the cost of it, not to guilt either of us, but because he genuinely believed that was simply what a father did. When I got my associate's degree, the first in either side of our family to finish any kind of higher education, he took an entire vacation day, unpaid, just to sit in the audience, and he cried, openly, in a way I'd never seen him cry before or since, and told me afterward that watching me walk across that stage was the proudest he'd ever been of anything in his whole life, including his own 30 years of careful, precise work. I tell you all of this because I think it's important, watching a story like this unfold, not to lose sight of the actual person underneath the paperwork. My father was never, in his whole life, a man who needed managing. He managed himself and managed us, with a quiet competence I recognize now as the exact same quality I inherited from him and eventually turned toward protecting him. Watching that competence erode, slowly, month by month, has been the hardest thing I've ever witnessed. And watching someone try to take advantage of what remained, at his own birthday party, is the reason I stopped being gentle about naming what was happening and started being precise instead. I noticed the first irregularity almost by accident, in the way you usually notice the beginning of something, which is to say I wasn't looking for it at all. I'd started about a year into Dad's diagnosis, quietly reviewing his bank statements online each month, not because I had any legal authority to at that point, just because he'd given me his login years earlier to help him pay bills when his eyesight started giving him trouble, and neither of us had ever thought to revoke that access. It was, in hindsight, exactly the kind of informal arrangement that works fine until it doesn't. In February, I noticed a withdrawal of $4,000 from his savings account, cash, at a branch I knew he hadn't visited himself in over a year, because I was the one who now drove him anywhere that required leaving the house. I called him and asked, gently, if he remembered withdrawing any money recently. He didn't. That, on its own, wasn't unusual by then. There were a lot of things he didn't remember. But when I asked Derek casually if he knew anything about it, he said, a little too quickly, that Dad had asked him to help with some home repair stuff, and he'd taken him to the bank himself. I let it go. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters to the story. I let it go because Derek was Dad's son too, and because accusing your own brother of something based on one withdrawal felt, at the time, like the kind of overreach I'd have been embarrassed to be caught making. I filed the question away, the way I file most things I'm not ready to act on yet, and I kept watching the statements. In March, there was another withdrawal. $6,500 this time, a check made out directly to Derek, memo line blank. I called Derek again, and this time his explanation had grown a little more elaborate. Dad wanted to help him with a security deposit on a new apartment, he said, and didn't want it to feel like a loan, so he'd just given it to him outright. I asked if he discussed that with Dad's actual finances in mind, given that Dad's retirement savings needed to last for what could be another 15 or 20 years of care. Derek told me I was being weird about it, and that Dad was still perfectly capable of deciding what to do with his own money. That sentence, Dad is still perfectly capable, is the one I want you to remember, because 6 weeks later, Derek would say the exact opposite sentence to a room full of family in service of a very different plan. I want to tell you about one more detail from that same week, because it's the piece that actually convinced me something was wrong, more than either withdrawal on its own. I called the branch where the second check had been cashed, using my father's account information, which I still technically had access to at that point through the old login. I asked the teller carefully whether she remembered the transaction and whether my father had been present. She couldn't discuss specifics with me, since I wasn't yet an authorized party on the account, but she did tell me gently that per their internal policy, any check over $5,000 required the account holder's photo ID to be presented in person at the counter, and that she personally recalled the transaction because the account holder had seemed, in her words, a little unsure about what he was signing. But the young man with him kept things moving along. She hadn't flagged it, because nothing about it was technically improper. My father was present, his ID matched, and unsureness alone isn't grounds for a bank to refuse a legal transaction. But her description sat with me for days afterward, the specific image of my father looking unsure while someone kept things moving along on his behalf. That was the moment the abstract worry became something I could no longer file away as an overreaction. A confused old man being gently rushed through a transaction he didn't fully understand is not, on its own, a crime. But it is exactly the kind of moment elder law exists to prevent, and I understood, driving home from that phone call, that whatever Derek was doing, he had found a gap wide enough to walk through, and nobody was standing in it yet. There was a third incident, smaller than the other two, that I only learned about weeks later, almost by accident, and it's worth including here because it changed how I understood the pattern entirely. My father mentioned offhand, during one of our Sunday visits, that Derek had asked him to be listed as a joint owner on a car Derek was planning to finance, just so the interest rate would be better, Dad explained, repeating, I assume, whatever Derek had told him. I hadn't seen any paperwork related to that, and when I gently asked my father whether he remembered signing anything for it, he wasn't sure. I called the dealership Derek worked for directly, using the pretext of asking about financing options myself, and confirmed carefully that no joint ownership application under my father's name had actually been submitted yet, which told me Derek had been testing the idea on our father in conversation, gauging how easily he'd agree, before ever committing it to paper. That detail, more than the 2 completed withdrawals, told me the scale of what Derek might eventually attempt if nobody intervened. He wasn't simply taking advantage of confusion when it happened to be convenient. He was, whether he fully admitted it to himself or not, beginning to test how far our father's trust could be stretched. By the end of March, I'd stopped letting things go. I sat down with my father on a good day. He had good days and bad days by then, and I'd learned to plan anything important around the good ones, and I asked him plainly whether he'd meant to give Derek $10,500 over 2 months. He looked at me, confused, and said, "I don't remember giving him that much. I might have. I don't know, Vivi." The uncertainty in his voice, more than any single number, is what finally moved me to act. I called the elder law attorney we'd consulted 18 months earlier, a careful, unhurried woman named Sandra Pruitt who specializes almost entirely in capacity and guardianship issues. I explained what I'd noticed. She asked me a question I hadn't fully considered yet. "Does your father currently have a power of attorney designated to anyone?" He didn't. In all the planning we'd done after his diagnosis, we discussed it, put it on a list, and never quite gotten around to finalizing it, the way families put off the paperwork that acknowledges the thing they don't want to be true yet. Sandra was direct with me in a way I've come to appreciate deeply since. If your father still has capacity, and from what you're describing, he may still have enough on his good days, the cleanest thing to do is have him formally designate someone now, while he can still clearly express that choice, before anyone else tries to get there first. She didn't say Derek's name. She didn't need to. I understood exactly what she meant. I brought my father to Sandra's office on a Tuesday morning, one of his clearer mornings, the kind where his sentences held together and his memory of the conversation, when I checked with him afterward, mostly stayed with him for hours instead of minutes. Sandra spent nearly 45 minutes with him alone, without me in the room, assessing, in her words, whether he understood what he was signing and why. At the end of that meeting, my father signed a durable power of attorney naming me as his agent, along with an advance healthcare directive doing the same. Sandra documented the capacity assessment carefully, in writing, with a note in the file about the date, the time, and his specific, unprompted answers to her questions about what the document meant and why he wanted it. I didn't tell Derek. I want to explain why, because I think it's the part of this story people are most likely to judge me for, and I'd rather explain it honestly than let you assume something colder than what actually happened. I didn't tell him because I didn't yet know what he was planning, only that something about his explanations no longer added up, and I didn't want to hand him advance warning to either accelerate his own plan or find some way around mine. I filed the documents. I kept driving Dad to his appointments. I kept the family dinners exactly as normal as they'd always been. And I waited to see what Derek would do next. I want to describe that appointment with Sandra a little more fully, because it turned out to matter enormously later, and because I think it's useful for anyone watching this who's facing something similar with their own parent. Sandra didn't simply hand my father a document and ask him to sign it. She spent the first 20 minutes of that 45-minute meeting just talking with him, about his career at the machine shop, about my mother, about what he understood was happening to his memory lately. She was gauging, in a conversational, unhurried way, whether he could track a conversation, whether his answers were consistent, whether he understood, in his own words, why we were there. Only after that did she walk him through the actual document, sentence by sentence, stopping frequently to ask him to explain back to her what a given section meant. At one point she asked him directly, "If you sign this, what does it let Vivian do?" And he answered, slowly but clearly, "Take care of my money and my doctors if I can't." She wrote that answer down, verbatim, in her file notes, along with the date and time. That single sentence, documented in his own words, on a clear morning, 6 weeks before Derek's folder ever appeared at a birthday dinner, turned out to be worth more than almost anything else in this entire story. Before I left her office that day, Sandra spent a few extra minutes with me alone and told me something I've repeated to more than one friend since, whenever this exact situation has come up in their own families. She said that in her experience, financial exploitation of an aging parent almost never looks like a stranger scamming someone over the phone, the version most people picture when they hear the phrase. It looks, far more often, like a family member who genuinely believes they're entitled to early access to money that will eventually be theirs anyway, moving faster than caution allows, precisely because they trust their own good intentions enough not to examine them closely. The people who do this rarely think of themselves as doing anything wrong, she told me. That's actually what makes them dangerous. Malice is easy to spot. Entitlement dressed up as help is much harder. I didn't fully understand how precisely that description would fit Derek until 6 weeks later, watching him uncap a pen at our father's birthday party with total easy confidence that what he was doing counted as helping. If you've ever quietly protected something before you fully understood what you were protecting it from, comment filed first below. What Derek brought to that birthday dinner 6 weeks later is worse than I expected, even having already prepared for it. My father's 70th birthday fell on a Saturday in May, and Derek, uncharacteristically, took the lead on planning it, booked the private room at the steakhouse Dad had always liked, ordered the cake, sent the invitations to extended family himself instead of leaving it to me the way he usually did. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was nice to see him take something on. I understand now that I should have found it strange instead. 2 days before the party, my cousin Marisol called me, the way Renee-type relatives always seem to call in these stories, carrying information they're not entirely sure they should be sharing. Vivi, I probably shouldn't say anything, but my mom said Derek mentioned bringing some paperwork to the party. Something about making things official for your dad, since he's not doing so well. She said he made it sound like it was already decided you'd both sign off on it. Marisol's voice had the same careful, apologetic tone I imagine most people use right before they hand you a piece of information that changes how you walk into a room. I thanked her. I didn't call Derek to ask about it directly, for the same reason I hadn't told him about Sandra's office weeks earlier. I wanted to see, clearly and without warning, exactly what he intended to put in front of our father, and exactly how he intended to get it signed. What I did instead was call Sandra, tell her what Marisol had described, and ask her plainly what my legal footing actually was if Derek showed up with his own power of attorney document and tried to get our father to sign it at a birthday dinner. Sandra's answer was the one that finally let me walk into that party without dread. If your father already has a validly executed power of attorney naming you, properly assessed for capacity and on file, then a second, competing document, especially one obtained without any capacity assessment, at a birthday party, informally, is going to have a very hard time holding up against what you already have. That doesn't mean Derek won't try. It just means you're not walking in unprotected. She paused, then added something I've thought about often since. The date matters enormously here, Vivian. You filed first. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. I should tell you about my husband here, because he matters to how the evening actually unfolded, even though, unlike some of these family confrontation stories you might have watched before, he isn't a lawyer, and there was no dramatic professional reveal waiting at that table. My husband, Marcus Bell, is a hospice social worker, which meant that by the time Derek's birthday plan surfaced, Marcus had already sat through more family conflicts over aging parents and contested caregiving than either of us could count professionally, just from opposite sides of the same kind of table. I told him everything the night Marisol called, the withdrawals, Sandra's office, the filed power of attorney, and now, the paperwork Derek was apparently planning to bring to Saturday's dinner. Marcus listened the way he listens to families in crisis at work, without interrupting, without rushing to a conclusion before he had the whole shape of it. When I finished, he asked me one question. Do you want to stop him before he tries, or do you want to let him try, and be ready when he does? I sat with that question for longer than I expected to. Some part of me wanted to call Derek that night, lay it all out, avoid the scene entirely. But another part of me, the part that reads insurance denials for a living, that has learned exactly how often a quiet correction gets ignored while a public one gets remembered, understood that if I intervened privately, Derek would simply find a smaller room to try again in. I wanted the whole family, the aunts and cousins who'd be at that dinner, to see plainly what he'd been attempting, not because I wanted to humiliate him, but because I didn't want to spend the next however many years of our father's decline defending a boundary that nobody else in the family had ever been shown the reason for. Let him try, I told Marcus. I just don't want to be the only one in the room who understands what's actually happening when he does. Marcus and I had been married for 6 years by then, long enough that he'd sat through more than one version of this exact family dynamic playing out at a distance, in stories I'd tell him after visiting my father, without ever quite naming what it was. He'd met my father only twice before the diagnosis, both times at holidays, both times brief and pleasant in the low-key way first introductions to a new son-in-law tend to be. It was after the diagnosis that Marcus actually got to know him, driving out with me on weekends, sitting with my father while I ran errands, learning, the way Marcus learns everything, patiently and without making a project out of it, which of Dad's stories he liked to retell and which topics made him anxious to discuss. By the time of that 70th birthday, Marcus wasn't a distant in-law watching family drama from the sidelines. He was someone who genuinely loved my father, in his own quiet way, and I think that mattered enormously to how steady he stayed at that table when it counted. We talked, in the 2 days before the party, about how much Marcus should say if the moment came, and how much I wanted to say myself. He was clear that he didn't want to speak over me, or turn my family's crisis into an opportunity to demonstrate his professional expertise. "This is your family," he told me. "I'll back you up completely, but you should be the one who says it first. He needs to hear it from you, not from me." I've thought about that instruction many times since, because I think it's part of why the confrontation landed the way it did, not as two professionals ganging up on Derek, but as a sister, finally, saying plainly what she'd been quietly managing for 2 years. Marcus told me that same night about a family he'd worked with the year before, in hospice, where a very similar dynamic had played out with far worse consequences, because nobody had caught it in time. An elderly patient of his, dying of pancreatic cancer, had a son who'd convinced him, in his final confused weeks, to sign over the rights to a small rental property the family had owned for decades, property that was meant, under a will drafted years earlier, to be split evenly among 3 children. By the time the other 2 siblings realized what had happened, their father had already passed, and the transfer, however ethically questionable, had been executed while he was still, technically, deemed to have capacity by a notary who'd spent perhaps 5 minutes with him. "There was no folder like the one Sandra made for your dad," Marcus told me. "No documented conversation establishing what he actually understood. Just a signature, and a family that spent the next 2 years in a legal fight none of them could really afford, emotionally or financially." He said it plainly, not to frighten me, but because I think he wanted me to understand exactly what the paperwork I'd already filed was actually protecting against. Not an abstract risk, but the specific, ordinary tragedy he watched play out in his own work more often than most people would ever guess. I spent the 2 days before the party doing the thing that has always calmed me the most. I built a folder. Not to escalate anything, I want to be clear, but because if the evening required proof, I intended to have more of it than anyone at that table expected. I printed the durable power of attorney Sandra had drafted, with its capacity assessment notes attached. I printed the bank statements showing the 2 withdrawals to Derek, dated, totaled, $10,500 in 6 weeks. And I wrote, by hand, a single page listing every appointment, every medication refill, every hard conversation I'd sat through with our father over the previous 18 months, not as a weapon, but as a record, the way I'd document a patient's case history before an appeal, because numbers and dates, I've learned, carry weight that feelings alone rarely do in a room that's already decided what story it wants to believe. If you've ever quietly prepared for a confrontation you hoped you wouldn't need, comment "ready" below. The party is next, and Derek brought exactly what Marisol said he would. The private room at the steakhouse was warm and a little too loud, the way these rooms always are once the extended family arrives. Aunts, cousins, my father's 2 remaining brothers, all of them gathered around a long table with a banner that read "Happy 70th, Walter" in gold letters. My father looked genuinely happy that night, one of his clearer evenings, laughing at something my uncle said, wearing the paper crown one of the younger cousins had insisted on putting on him. I remember being grateful, in the middle of everything I already suspected was coming, that at least this part of the evening was real. I sat next to my father through most of dinner, close enough to catch it if his confusion started to show in ways that might embarrass him in front of relatives he only saw a few times a year. He told my Uncle Theo, twice within 15 minutes, the same story about a machine he'd fixed at the shop decades ago, and both times Theo laughed exactly as warmly as if he were hearing it for the first time, which is its own quiet kindness I've come to notice and appreciate more since Dad's diagnosis than I ever did before it. Marisol's mother, my Aunt Joyce, asked me quietly at one point how Dad had been doing, the real question underneath the polite one, and I gave her the honest, careful answer I'd learned to give by then. Some days better than others, and we're managing. Derek arrived a little late, carrying the cake box himself, and I noticed, the moment he set it down, a slim black folder tucked under his other arm, the kind of folder you'd bring to a meeting, not a birthday party. He caught me looking at it and smiled easily, the way he smiles at everything, and said, "Just some paperwork stuff, don't worry about it, Vivi. Boring adult things." I said nothing. I let him believe, for a little longer, that I didn't already know exactly what kind of boring adult thing it was. Dinner went the way birthday dinners go, plates cleared, stories told. My father asked twice within 20 minutes whether the cake had come yet, each time as though it were the first time he'd asked. Nobody at the table treated the repetition as strange. We'd all, by then, learned the particular gentleness required to answer the same question kindly, over and over, without making him feel the gap in his own memory. It was when the cake arrived, candles lit, the room dimming slightly the way rooms do for a birthday song, that Derek made his move. He waited until the singing finished, until my father had made his wish and blown out most of the candles with help from a cousin's toddler, and then, in the warm, unsuspicious glow of everyone still smiling at the cake, he opened the folder and set it on the table in front of our father, pen already uncapped in his other hand. "Dad," he said, gently, warmly, the exact tone you'd use to help someone through something simple. "Remember we talked about this? Just need you to initial here, and sign at the bottom. It's just so I can help take care of things for you, since it's getting harder to keep track of everything." He said it easily, the way you'd explain any small favor, and I watched my father, disoriented by the candles and the singing and the crowd, pick up the pen the way he picked up any pen handed to him, trusting, the way he trusted everyone in that room, that whatever he was signing was exactly what his son said it was. He got one initial down, a small, uncertain scrawl at the bottom of the first page, before I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I want you to picture the opposite of a scene, because that's closer to what actually happened. I walked around the table, set my own folder down flat on the tablecloth beside the cake, close enough that Derek and my father could both see it, and I said evenly, "Actually, Dad already has someone managing his affairs. Me. Since March." The room went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when it senses a shift it can't yet name. My Aunt Patrice, seated closest to Derek, glanced down at the folder in front of my father, then at mine, then back up at both our faces, the way you'd watch two cars you suspected were about to collide. Derek's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life, a flicker of genuine confusion, quickly replaced by the practiced ease he uses for almost everything, the ease that has gotten him out of nearly every difficult moment of his adult life. "What are you talking about, Vivi? Dad doesn't have anything like that set up. I would know." I opened my folder to the first page and turned it so it faced the table, not just Derek. "This is a durable power of attorney, executed in March, at Sandra Pruitt's office. She's an elder law attorney. She assessed Dad's capacity herself, in writing, before he signed anything. It's already on file with his bank and his doctor's office." My father, watching the exchange with the particular confusion of someone trying to follow a conversation moving faster than he could hold on to, looked down at the pen still in his hand, then at the page in front of him, then at me. "Vivi, what is this one?" he asked, gesturing at Derek's folder, and I understood in that moment that he genuinely did not know what he'd just begun signing. "That, More than anything, Derek said afterward, told me everything I needed to know about how this had been explained to him beforehand. That's a different document, Dad, I said gently, keeping my voice as level and unhurried as I could manage. You don't need to sign anything else tonight. You already have things set up the way you wanted them, back in March. Do you remember going to Sandra's office with me? He thought about it for a moment, and something in his face cleared, slightly. The nice lady with the office with the plants, he said. Yes, I remember the plants. It wasn't a full memory of the legal substance of that meeting, but it was real, and it was his, and it was more than Derek's folder had ever offered him. An actual memory, instead of a pen pressed into his hand mid-song. If you've ever watched someone realize, in real time, that they were about to sign something they didn't understand, comment the pen down below. What Derek said next is the part that finally told the whole room the truth. Derek recovered the way he always recovers, by reaching for charm first and only reaching for facts when charm failed. Okay, this is, Vivi, can we not do this at Dad's birthday? Whatever paperwork you got him to sign, we can talk about it later. I'm just trying to help Dad get his affairs in order before things get worse. Someone has to think ahead here. He said it warmly, to the room, not to me, the way you'd frame an accusation as concern so that anyone listening would side with the concern instead of questioning the framing. I let that land for a second before I answered it, because I wanted my voice to stay exactly as calm as it had been all evening. I have been thinking ahead, Derek. Since March. That's what this folder is. I turned to the second page. This is Dad's bank statement from February and March. There's a $4,000 cash withdrawal here, and a $6,500 check made out to you, memo line blank. When I asked you about both of those, you told me two different stories, home repairs, and then a security deposit on an apartment. Which one was it? The room had gone very still. My Uncle Theo, my father's older brother, set down his fork. Derek's face flushed, the charm draining out of it in real time, replaced by something closer to the expression he used to wear as a teenager, right before getting caught in something he'd hoped nobody would ask about directly. That money was a gift, he said, but his voice had lost its earlier ease. Dad wanted to help me. He's allowed to help me. He might have, I said. I'm not saying he didn't want to help you, Derek. I'm saying that when I asked him directly, a few weeks ago, whether he remembered giving you over $10,000, he told me he didn't remember doing that at all. That's not a small detail. That's the exact reason Sandra assessed his capacity before he signed anything with me, because at this stage, his good days and his confused days can look identical from the outside, and someone needs to be checking which one you're standing in front of before you hand him a pen. Aunt Patrice, quietly, asked the question I think everyone at the table wanted answered. Derek, did you have an attorney look at whatever you were having Walter sign tonight? Derek didn't answer right away, and his silence answered for him. It's a standard form, he said finally, a little defensively. I found it online. It's not complicated. It's just a power of attorney form. I hadn't planned to mention the car, but something about the way he said, it's not complicated, pushed me to. Is that the same standard form you were going to use to put yourself on Dad's car loan? I asked, keeping my voice level. Derek went very still. How do you know about that? He said, quieter now, and I could hear, underneath the question, the particular alarm of someone realizing they've been observed longer and more carefully than they assumed. Dad mentioned it to me a few weeks ago, I said. He didn't understand it was a loan he'd be liable for. He thought it was just a favor that made your interest rate better. I checked with the dealership. Nothing had actually been filed yet, so I let it go, because I didn't want to accuse you of something you hadn't done. But sitting here tonight, watching this folder, I don't think it was a coincidence that both of these ideas came from the same place at the same time. Nobody at the table said anything for a moment. I watched my Uncle Theo's expression shift, the way a person's face shifts when they're doing arithmetic they didn't want to be doing at a birthday party. My father, who had been listening to all of this with the effortful concentration I'd come to recognize on his harder evenings, said something then that I don't think anyone at that table expected, including me. "I don't want to sign anything I don't understand," he said, quietly, but clearly, each word landing with more weight than anything else said that evening. "I like the lady with the plants. She explained it to me. Nobody explained this one." He pushed Derek's folder gently away from himself, across the tablecloth, the same unhurried, deliberate motion he'd used his whole life to set aside anything he decided he didn't want. Marcus, who had been sitting quietly beside me through all of it, exactly as we discussed beforehand, spoke for the first time then, not to Derek, but to the table generally, in the calm, practiced tone I imagine he uses with families at the hardest moments of his job. "I want to say gently that what just happened here is actually really common, and it doesn't have to mean anything terrible about anyone's intentions. Cognitive decline creates situations where the people who love someone most can genuinely convince themselves that moving fast is the same as helping. The problem isn't that Derek loves his dad. It's that nobody sat down with an outside professional first to make sure Walter actually understood what he was agreeing to. It wasn't an accusation. It was, I think, the one sentence in the whole evening that let Derek hear the correction without needing to defend himself against it. Uncle Theo, who rarely speaks at these gatherings, cleared his throat and said something I've thought about often since. Your father would be proud of you both handling this the way you just did, one of you protecting him with paperwork, and one of you, eventually, hearing it. I don't know if that was entirely fair to Derek in the moment, but it softened something in the room that had otherwise been tightening towards something worse. Derek didn't storm out, and I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell you this ended in a dramatic exit, and it didn't. What actually happened was quieter and, I think, harder for him in its own way. He sat there, folder closed in front of him, while the rest of the table slowly, awkwardly, returned to eating cake, the way families do when they've collectively decided the confrontation is over even though nobody has said so out loud. About 20 minutes later, once most of the extended family had drifted into smaller conversations, Derek came and sat beside me, and for the first time all evening, his voice didn't have any performance left in it. "I wasn't trying to steal from him, Vivi," he said. I've got debt. Bad debt. And I figured he's going to leave us both money eventually anyway, and I needed it now, and it felt easier to just handle it directly with him instead of asking you, because you'd have said no." I let that sit for a moment before I answered. "You're right that I'd have said no," I told him. "Not because I don't want to help you, Derek. Because Dad's money isn't an inheritance yet. It's what has to pay for his care for however many years he has left, and neither of us knows how many that is. If you need help with debt, that's a real conversation we can have, honestly, between the two of us. What you did tonight wasn't that conversation. It was trying to get a confused 70-year-old man to sign something he didn't understand at his own birthday party before anyone else could stop you. He didn't argue with that. That, more than anything else said that night, told me he understood exactly what I meant. The drive home with Marcus that night was quiet for a long stretch, the particular quiet that follows an evening that took more out of you than you expected while it was happening. Somewhere past the halfway point, he reached over and put his hand on mine, still on the gearshift, and said, "You did that exactly right. Calm. Factual. No theater. I've watched 100 families try to have that same conversation and turn it into a screaming match that nobody remembers clearly afterward. Nobody in that room is going to forget what you actually said tonight, because you never gave them a louder moment to remember instead." I didn't feel triumphant driving home, the way I think some version of me might have expected to feel. I mostly felt tired, and a little sad, the particular sadness of watching a family absorb a hard truth about itself all at once, even when the truth needed telling. If you've ever had to name, plainly, the difference between someone needing help and someone taking advantage, comment the difference below. What happened over the following weeks mattered more to me than anything said at that dinner table. Aunt Patrice called me 2 days after the party, and hers was the call I hadn't expected to matter as much as it did. She told me she'd had almost the identical experience with her own mother, my grandmother, 15 years earlier, a cousin who tried to get power of attorney signed at a hospital bedside, rushed, without any outside assessment, and how the family had spent years afterward untangling the financial mess that followed because nobody had stopped it in the moment. I didn't say anything at the table because I wasn't sure it was my place, she told me, but I want you to know what you did took real nerve, and it's the exact thing nobody did for my mother. I hadn't known that history existed in our family at all, and hearing it explained, suddenly, why Patrice had watched the whole exchange so carefully rather than looking away. My cousin Marisol, the one who'd warned me in the first place, texted me the next morning, relieved, she said, that she hadn't caused a rift by telling me. I told her the opposite was true, that she'd given me the only real advantage I'd had walking into that room, which was simply knowing, in advance, what shape the evening was going to take. Other relatives were quieter about it, the way families often are about the parts of a conflict they didn't witness directly, but I noticed, at the next few gatherings, a subtle shift in how people spoke to Derek and me about our father's care, fewer casual jokes about whoever ends up dealing with all that, more direct questions about what actually needed doing and who was actually doing it. I think, in its own way, that dinner did something none of my quiet 18 months of driving Dad to appointments ever had. It made the invisible labor visible to people who had simply never had a reason to look at it closely before. I told the story in a much shorter version to a coworker at the hospital a few weeks later, mostly because she'd noticed I'd been distracted and asked if everything was all right. She listened, and then she told me something that stayed with me for a long time afterward, that she saw a version of this exact dynamic constantly in her own work processing appeals for elderly patients, families discovering, usually far too late, that a sibling had quietly redirected a parent's benefits or signed them onto something they didn't understand. "You caught it early," she told me. "Most people I deal with are calling me after the damage is already done, trying to find some clause that lets them undo it. You're the rare case where someone actually got ahead of it." I hadn't thought of my own situation in those terms before, as a kind of appeal filed before the denial ever happened, rather than after. It stayed with me as one of the more useful ways I've found to describe what those 8 weeks between January and March actually accomplished. Derek called me 3 days after the party, and it was, to his credit, the most direct conversation we'd had in years. He apologized, not vaguely, but specifically, for the withdrawals, for bringing the document to the party instead of a real conversation, for letting our father's confusion become something he used instead of something he protected. I told him I appreciated him saying it plainly, and that I wasn't interested in cutting him out of Dad's care, but that going forward, any decision involving Dad's finances or his medical care would go through me, because that's what the power of attorney existed to formalize, not as a punishment, but as a safeguard neither of us should have had to build alone in the first place. I want to be honest about something I considered doing in the days after that dinner, and ultimately didn't. Sandra had mentioned, when I first called her about the withdrawals, that in cases involving a diagnosed capacity issue and documented financial transfers, families sometimes have grounds to file a report with Adult Protective Services, and that doing so isn't necessarily adversarial. It can simply trigger an independent review that protects everyone, including the person who took the money, from further escalation. I sat with that option seriously for almost a week. In the end, I didn't file it, not because I thought Derek was blameless, but because I believed, watching him at that dinner table and in the days after, that he was capable of correcting course without a formal investigation attached to his name, and I wanted to give him the chance to prove that before I took a step that couldn't easily be undone. I want to be clear that I don't think that's the right call for every family in this situation. Sometimes a formal report is exactly what's needed, especially if the person doesn't show any willingness to acknowledge what happened. It was the right call for mine because Derek met the moment, once it was in front of him, with something closer to honesty than I expected. He asked quietly whether he could still be involved. Visits, holidays, the ordinary texture of being Dad's son. I told him, of course, that none of this had ever been about removing him from our father's life, only about making sure our father's life, and what remained of his money, was protected from anyone's good intentions turning, even accidentally, into harm. I want to tell you honestly that Derek paid back some of the $10,500 over the following months, in installments, unprompted. Not all of it, His debt situation, it turned out, was real and significant, and I didn't want to push him into a worse financial hole just to make a symbolic point. But he paid back what he reasonably could, and more importantly, he started calling me before making any request of our father, instead of after. That, to me, mattered more than the money ever did. My father's decline has continued in the months since, the way these things do, some days clear, most days a little less clear than the day before. I've kept every record Sandra told me to keep, every receipt, every appointment, every conversation, the way I'd chart anything that matters. Not because I expect to need them again. Because knowing I could, if I ever had to, is sometimes enough to let me focus on the parts of caring for him that actually deserve my attention, not the paperwork, but the man underneath it, the one who still, on his good days, remembers the lady with the plants, and trusts that whatever I put in front of him, I've already read closely enough for both of us. I went back to see Sandra about 2 months after the birthday party, mostly for a routine review of the paperwork, but partly, I think, because I wanted to tell someone outside the family how the evening had actually gone. She listened to the whole account, and then she told me something practical that I've held onto since. The next thing you'll want to think about, she said, is whether your father's existing will and any beneficiary designations on his accounts still reflect what he'd actually want, given everything you've now confirmed about how easily those wishes could be pressured. It's worth reviewing while he can still clearly participate in that conversation, rather than waiting until a future crisis forces the question. We spent the following weeks doing exactly that, sitting with my father on his clearer mornings, walking through what he wanted for the house, for what remained of his savings, for Derek and me both, and documenting it the same careful way Sandra had documented the original power of attorney. It wasn't a dramatic process. It was slow, patient, sometimes repetitive, since my father would occasionally forget a decision we'd already made together and need to revisit it a second or third time. But by the end of it, everything that mattered was written down, in his own stated wishes, witnessed and notarized, in a way that left as little room as possible for anyone, in the future, to argue that he hadn't understood what he wanted. Thanksgiving came 7 months after that birthday party, and it was, in its own quiet way, the proof I'd been waiting for that something real had actually shifted. Derek arrived early for once, and spent nearly an hour in the kitchen with our father, patient in a way I hadn't seen from him before, helping him find the words when a sentence trailed off halfway through, the way I'd learned to do over the previous 2 years. At one point I heard him ask our father, gently, "Do you want me to check with Vivi before we do that, Dad?" About something as small as whether Dad could have a second helping of dessert given his blood sugar medication, and I understood, hearing it, that the safeguard I'd built wasn't just protecting our father anymore. It had become, slowly, the new shape of how Derek and I worked together, instead of around each other. I didn't file that power of attorney because I suspected Derek of anything specific back in January. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as though I'd seen the whole plan coming from the start, and I hadn't. I filed it because I'd learned, slowly, over 18 months of watching my father's memory soften at the edges, that love without documentation is a house with no locks on the doors. Not because the people around you are necessarily going to walk through them uninvited, but because you can't know, in advance, which ones will, and the people most likely to try are rarely strangers. I think about the specific timing of it often, the fact that I filed in March, and Derek's plan surfaced fully in May, and how easily those 2 dates could have landed the other way around. If I'd waited even 8 more weeks to make that appointment with Sandra, if I'd told myself, the way I'd told myself for years, that I was overreacting, that Derek surely wouldn't, that bringing in a lawyer felt like an accusation I hadn't earned yet, I think about what that birthday dinner would have looked like instead. A folder with no competing folder beside it. A room full of relatives with no reason to doubt what they were watching. My father, trusting, signing something that would have quietly reshaped the rest of his care around whatever Derek decided he needed it to say. That gap of 8 weeks is the entire story, when I really sit with it. Not the confrontation. The paperwork that came before anyone knew a confrontation was coming. What I took from that birthday dinner wasn't triumph over my brother. I don't feel triumphant about any of it, even now. What I took from it is smaller, and I think more useful to anyone watching this who's caring for a parent whose mind is slipping out from under them 1 quiet inch at a time. Protecting someone you love doesn't always look like intervention in the moment. Sometimes it looks like paperwork filed months in advance, quietly, before anyone else even knows there's a race happening. The folder I brought to that dinner wasn't a weapon. It was simply the record of having shown up, consistently, before the moment required proof that I had. I also want to say something to anyone watching this who recognizes themselves in Derek more than in me, because I don't think every sibling in his position is acting out of malice, and I don't think mine was either, not entirely. There is a specific kind of desperation that comes from watching a parent's money exist as an abstract future inheritance while you're drowning in a present-tense debt, and that desperation can make an otherwise decent person convince themselves that taking early isn't really taking at all. If that's you, I'd ask you to consider the version of this story where your sibling never builds the folder, where nobody ever stops you, and you spend the rest of your life knowing exactly what you did to a parent who trusted you completely. That knowledge doesn't go away just because nobody else in the family ever finds out. I think, in the end, Derek was relieved to be stopped, even though it didn't feel that way to him at the table. Being stopped, sometimes, is its own kind of mercy. If you're in the position I was in a year ago, watching a parent's memory soften, unsure whether you're overreacting to worry that hasn't fully named itself yet, I want to leave you with the practical version of what I learned, not just the emotional one. Get a proper capacity assessment done by an elder law attorney while your parent can still clearly participate in that conversation, not after a crisis forces the question. Keep your own quiet record of transfers, appointments, and conversations, the same way you chart anything that matters professionally, even if you never expect to need it. And don't wait for someone else in the family to raise the concern first, because the people most likely to take advantage of a gap are rarely strangers, and they are almost never in a hurry to point out that the gap exists. The folder doesn't have to be dramatic. It just has to exist before the moment someone else decides to hand your parent a pen. My father is still here. Some days he knows exactly who I am and asks, with real concern, whether I'm eating enough and working too hard, the way he always has. Other days he calls me by my mother's name and I answer to it anyway, because correcting him in those moments serves nobody but my own need to be recognized, and his comfort matters more to me than my accuracy. Either way, I know that whatever decisions still need to be made on his behalf, they'll be made carefully, by someone who read the whole document before asking him to trust it. If someone you love is starting to lose their grip on the details that used to hold their life together, you don't need a dramatic confrontation to protect them. You need to file first. Ask the careful questions early, while the answers still hold. And when someone hands the person you love a pen at exactly the wrong moment, you need to be close enough, and ready enough, to set your own folder down beside it before the ink dries. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who's caring for a parent right now and could use the reminder that documentation is its own quiet act of love. Comment, filed first, below, and subscribe to Calm Drama Stories. We'll keep the door open. We'll keep the books.